This is PTV World. I am Syed Shabahat Ali and you're watching Fault Lines. The problems between United States and Iran have been boiling for last 2 years. But the situation is simmering for last several decades. The point of contention between the two sides are so many, including the control on Iran's oil reserves, United States' repeated interference in the political matters of Tehran, but above all is the increasing influence of Iran in the Middle East. United States also have problems with Iran's nuclear program. But all of this have boiled down to economic sanctions against Iran. These sanctions that started from the middle 90s by now have reached a back-breaking point for the Iranian economy. The GDP is in a minus growth. The currency is devaluated more than any other currency in the world, and the inflation is on record high. In 2015, President Barack Obama made an enormous step and signed a deal with the government of Iran, taking European Union and UK on their own side. But in 2018, this deal was sabotaged by Donald Trump in a remarkable statement. Watch this.
Highest and most solemn duty is the defense of our nation and its citizens. Last night, at my direction, the United States military successfully executed a flawless precision strike that killed the #1 terrorist anywhere in the world, Qasem Soleimani. Under my leadership, America's policy is unambiguous to terrorists who harm or intend to harm any American. We will find you, we will eliminate you, we will always protect our diplomats, service members, all Americans, and our allies. For years, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and its ruthless Quds Force under Soleimani's leadership has targeted, injured, and murdered hundreds of American civilians and servicemen. What the United States did yesterday should have been done long ago. A lot of lives would have been saved. Just recently, Soleimani led the brutal repression of protesters in Iran, where more than 1,000 innocent civilians were tortured and killed by their own government. We took action last night to stop a war. We did not take action to start a war. I have deep respect for the Iranian people. They are a remarkable people with an incredible heritage and unlimited potential. We do not seek regime change. However, the Iranian regime's aggression in the region, including the use of proxy fighters to destabilize its neighbors, must end, and it must end now. The future belongs to the people of Iran, those who seek peaceful coexistence and cooperation, not the terrorist warlords who plunder their nation to finance bloodshed abroad.
The major critique of this unilateral action by United States of America and then President Donald Trump was Joe Biden. He had made a remarkable statement against this unilateral action. And he said,
6 months ago, here in New York City, I made the case that Donald Trump was dangerously incompetent and incapable of world leadership. And the past few days, in the wake of the killing of the Iranian General Soleimani, I think Donald Trump has proven beyond that comment beyond dispute. And folks, in wake of such an enormous escalation that has exploded geopolitics in the region, and put the United States and Iran on a collision course, what would we expect from an American president? Well, what have we heard from President Trump? We have not heard a sober-minded explanation to reassure the American people that this decision and its consequences were thought through. No level-headed words meant to dial down the tensions and to take us off the path of conflict. President Trump has no strategy here, it seems to me. He has no end game. And here's the hardest truth of all. His constant mistakes and poor decision-making have left us, the United States, with a severely limited slate of options for how to move forward. And most of those options are now bad. He should be immediately reaching out to our European partners and others and send private signals of deterrence and de-escalation to Iran and find a way to avoid the onrush of war. And the best way to do that, of course, would be for President Trump to rejoin the Iran deal and build on it. If Iran moves back in compliance with the obligations and reestablishes international consensus about how to confront these threats in Iran, we'll be much, much better off. The only way out of this crisis is through diplomacy. Clear-eyed, hard-nosed diplomacy grounded in a strategy that's not about one-off decisions and one-upsmanship. Diplomacy that's designed to de-escalate the crisis, protect our people, and secure our regional interests, including our counter-ISIS campaign. No one wants war, but it's going to take hard work to make sure we don't end up there by accident.
Now, when Joe Biden is President of the United States, we have to examine whether Iran's deal becomes the top priority of his team or not. To join me in today's conversation is a robust panel of experts. My guests of today's program are Michael Kugelman, Deputy Director, South Asia Affairs from Wilson Center, United States. I have Dr. Kaul from the University of Akron and Dr. Hussain Shahid Seherwardi, Chairman, IR Department, University of Peshawar. Michael Kugelman, what is the genesis of this crisis between United States and Iran? Do you actually agree that the real problem is Iran's nuclear plans?
It's true that today the U.S.-Iran crisis really revolves around the nuclear issue, but I would argue that it goes much deeper than that, particularly on the U.S. side. I would argue that the U.S. and successive U.S. governments in recent decades have tended to demonize Iran. They have looked at it through a very hostile lens, and that is because of some very traumatic events that took place in this relationship in previous decades. One was the Iranian coup, but the other, even more significantly, was the Iranian attack on the U.S. embassy. That was a huge factor. It had a huge impact on not just the American government's thinking about Iran, but also the thinking of the American public. And I would argue that the U.S. really demonizes Iran and depicts it negatively in popular culture, in film, and so forth. It does that on levels that it really doesn't with almost any other country. It's quite extraordinary, and this really is unfortunate because it obscures the fact that even though these are rivals, deep rivals, they actually do share a lot in common. There's quite a few interests that they share in common, whether you want to talk about support for a peaceful and stable Afghanistan, or you want to talk about opposition to international terrorists. There's a lot there, but bottom line is that the baggage of the past and some very significant events in the past have continued to shape U.S. thinking about Iran in ways that really are detrimental to the relationship on the whole.
But Michael, why United States is so scared of Iran's nuclear program? Do you actually think that this program is capable of haunting United States in the heartland of U.S.?
I think that the way that Americans perceive the threat posed by Iran's nuclear program really relates to how Americans look at Iran on the whole. I mean, for those Americans, and there are many of them, that are hawkish on Iran and believe that Iran poses a huge threat, that it should be seen as a pariah, that it is a huge threat to U.S. interests, naturally they will tend to be the most alarmed about Iran's nuclear program. For those that take a more reasonable position, I think the conclusion would be that this is not a program that poses a threat, particularly related to some other countries around the world that have nuclear weapons. But I do think that, for many Americans, including successive governments, they look at Iran as a country that has indeed threatened U.S. interests, mainly through its support for proxy organizations, whether you're talking about Hezbollah or other groups like that have undercut U.S. interests, either by threatening the U.S. directly or by threatening Israel, America's top ally. So I think the bottom line is that since Iran is seen as a threat to the U.S. and to its interests around the world, it follows that a nuclear program from Iran, regardless of how advanced or how much progress it's made, that will be seen as concerning for many in the United States. I am one of those people that think that America overstates the threat posed by Iran's nuclear program.
Dr. Carl, welcome to my program. And do you agree that the American threat perception regarding Iran's nuclear program is a bit overrated?
I do agree. Most Americans don't really have very much information about Iran. I agree completely that the popular presentation of Iran is extremely negative. And it tends to focus on the hostage crisis, events in the past, tends to focus on the very negative image that many have of the Islamic regime in Iran. So I agree that the public really is not very well informed about Iran, but I think those in the policy community in the United States, they do differ somewhat, but there is significant concern about Iran developing a nuclear program, part of because of the threat that it would pose to the United States, but also very much the threat that an Iranian nuclear program would pose to the United States' regional friends and allies in the Middle East. And I think that may even be more concerning to some people in the U.S. policy community, that if Iran does get closer to developing nuclear weapons, it would be very destabilizing and potentially lead to conflict in the Middle East region.
Dr. Hussain, how do you see the point of contention between United States and Iran as propagated its the nuclear program, but what is your take on it?
You have asked a very broad and very huge policy of United States towards Middle East in general and in particular Iran. As Carl just mentioned, nuclear program of Iran is not only destined towards and it is against the United States policy, but it is physically against the very close friends of United States in the region, that is Saudi Arabia and Israel. And of course, there are certain organizations in which are working in this region and who have very clearly declared Israel as their enemy number one in shape of Hezbollah. So in the circumstances, reaching this nuclear weapon these nuclear weapons to Israel are for that matter Saudi Arabia will not be an issue, and that is an issue for United States. So therefore, they are curbing they are curbing their clips, and they are so staunch over Iran. However, at the same time, there are a few more things, and one is intransigent attitude, very uncompromising attitude of ayatollahs in Iran. They are also not that flexible. Moreover, regime change in United States, replacement of Donald Trump with Joe Biden is also a very good omen, because Joe Biden was the vice president under Obama, and they were the ones who had signed Iran-U.S. nuclear deal, as per which it was very significant and it was very peaceful effort for the entire region. However, with the arrival of Donald Trump, that U.S.-Iran nuclear deal was scrapped. That, in fact, inflicted a very damaging effect to the peace process that had started in the past between Iran and United States. Now Joe Biden is in power, and I am anticipating that somehow he would revive that treaty, which was, as I stated, scrapped by Trump, because in this way, once Iran's nuclear program turns into for peace purposes, I said once it turns into for peaceful purposes, that would be the time when entire region will be peaceful, and probably in the long run, Iran and United States will develop diplomatic relations. But at the same time, Saudi Arabia and Israel will not feel that threatened from Iran as they are feeling now.
Dr. Hussain, let me take the input from Dr. Kaul. Dr. Kaul, unilaterally walking away from an agreement that has been signed by the President of the United States and then making up excuses, how do you think it has damaged the reputation of the United States to settle the international disputes?
Well, I think it damaged America's reputation pretty substantially, not just in the Middle East region, but globally. The United States had agreed to something that was considered very important. This was not a insignificant treaty or agreement in any way, shape, or form. This was very, very important with European allies involved. And so when the United States walked away from that, there were significant concerns that the United States could do this kind of thing again with other issues. So I think it did hurt the reputation of the United States as kind of a partner that could be trusted, that could be counted on. And I think one of the most important things is the significant distrust in Iran right now of the United States. Because even when Obama was still president, the United States did not walk back all of the sanctions against Iran. And so there's significant concern among Iranian policymakers that the United States may try to come back to the deal, but will slow walk getting away from sanctions, not fully comply with the agreement. And that's a pretty common view in Iran right now, that the United States really didn't comply the last time. So the distrust started even before Donald Trump.
Dr. Kaul, do you think that from Iran's perspective, US walking out of the deal and European Union standing in mid of nowhere helps their nuclear program in absence of any monitoring watchdog?
It does, but Iran would much rather have a deal than develop a nuclear program. They would much rather have economic relief than develop nuclear weapons. To me, this is my view, the nuclear weapons are very much a way to leverage the international community. Sure, there's definitely some gain to be made in that they are, for lack of a better word, a trump card, a deterrent from countries being aggressive with Iran or potentially threatening the integrity of Iran. But these nuclear weapons programs worked for Iran in the past in that they got the United States to the table, and they got the United States to the table quickly to agree to the nuclear deal. And I think Iran right now is trying the same formula. They're trying to get the United States to believe that they are serious about developing nuclear weapons if there is no return to the nuclear deal. So I think you'll see in the next weeks, even maybe months, a ratcheting up on the part of Iran to look like they're moving towards full nuclear capability in order to pressure the United States back into the deal. And so we're seeing a period of what you could call chicken between Iran and the United States, where both sides really don't want to back down to the other. And part of that's because of domestic politics in both countries. But at the same time, both sides want a deal. It's just how you get there. That's going to be the difficult part.
Dr. Hussain, do you agree with what just Dr. Kaul said?
Hello.
Dr. Hussain, do you agree with just Dr. Kaul what said at the moment?
To a certain extent, I agree. The reason is that issue that is taking place at the moment is expectations. Joe Biden has recently arrived, and many people are considering him a dove. He is not like a hawk. One thing. Second thing, as compared to last regime, we anticipate sensibility and sense in the policies, which means that if the last presidents have done something right, it should not be scrapped. And if something has gone wrong, it should be fixed. So with the arrival of Joseph Biden, wrongs have been fixed and rights have been revived. And in this spirit, we anticipate that the relations between the two countries, which means Iran and United States, will normalize not only that, but undue support to any friendly country in the region, and that may make problems for United States, would also be slightly withdrawn. I'm saying slightly withdrawn, and the reason is that I know that fully cannot be withdrawn because Americans have their own stakes in this region. So we have seen that with respect to Yemen, America has under Joe Biden, they have adopted a very sensible policy. So that kind of sensibility, if we see that there would be a lot of expectations and probably wrongs that have been done in the past would be fixed.
Michael Kugelman, United States has been blamed to use military muscle to settle disputes that could have been settled otherwise. It is said by Iranian side that United States has no respect for the international laws. What's your quick take on it?
Iran is a country that does not hesitate to criticize the United States in the most withering of terms, and it's not a surprise given the nature of the relationship, given how unhealthy it is. I do think that on some levels what India says about the U.S., what Iran says about the U.S. is accurate. This idea that the U.S. does not it flouts international law. There's something to that. I mean, if you look at some of the things that have happened in terms of how the U.S. has handled Iran, and certainly you look at the issue of the Trump administration deciding to assassinate Qasem Soleimani, certainly this is someone that was no angel, and he had posed, through his activities, had posed a threat to U.S. interests. But the fact that the U.S. decided to unilaterally stage an attack on him to kill him, certainly that would appear to violate several dimensions of international law. And I think that in that regard, some of the criticism of Iran of the U.S. is not necessarily that different from what other countries, including some U.S. allies, have said about the U.S., and particularly how the U.S. comported itself in the Trump era, when it essentially seemed to suggest that it had no need to obey or respect international laws. This was also a common criticism made of the George W. Bush administration, though also made of the Obama administration. So this criticism from Iran is striking, but I think it is rooted in some truth, and it is not new, as it's been heard in many contexts.
Dr. Karl, how would Joe Biden take it on from this point? We have seen in the past that Trump was trying to undo most of the things done by President Barack Obama. Do you think the current regime will also try to undo most of the things done by the previous president of the United States?
I don't think Biden's is obsessed with undoing what Trump did compared to Trump being fairly obsessed with undoing what Obama did. I think there are actually some areas of agreement between the Trump administration and the Biden administration. For example, on the issue of China, which I know is not the topic of today's discussion, but Biden looks at China very similarly to the way that Trump has looked at China. But I think even with the policy towards Iran, there's some continuity. We're not going back to 2014. I think there's increased distrust of Iran, even in the Biden camp, and there's a clear-eyed vision that Iranian domestic politics is changing, and there's a good potential that we'll see hardliners come to power in the presidency in Iran. Even though they don't really make foreign policy, it still creates a tone in the country that will be difficult for the United States to deal with. So I don't really look at the Biden policies as trying to gain political points in order to say, oh, we're different than Trump. I think Biden's primary interest, not just with Iran, but with the Middle East, is to get back to a deal that stabilizes the Middle East, that does not create a situation where Iran looks like it's engaging in nuclear breakout, and that creates a panicked Israel, a panicked Saudi Arabia, and then we see real potential for conflict.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hussain. Thank you very much, Michael Kugelman and Dr. Karl from Akron University for joining my program. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll take a short break and we'll join you back in a while. Welcome back to the program. I have with me from Iran Sayyid Mustafa Khoshchasham. He's editor-in-chief and analyst of Iran's Foreign Policy Journal. Welcome to the program, Mustafa. Mustafa, my first question. Why Iran is always accused of maneuvering its military muscle outside Iran? We have allegations from United States blaming Iran to muster its military muscle in Yemen, Syria, Iran, and even Iraq and even Afghanistan.
Hello, and thanks for having me. Well, Iran never intended to spread forces in the region. It was called by the Syrian government as well as the Iraqi government when they came under attack by terrorist forces from 84 nations. They called for help. The Iraqi Kurdistan region President Barzani has stressed in several interviews that when they called for help when their Erbil, their main city in Kurdistan, was under siege by Daesh or ISIS, they called for the United States help, for the Europeans help, but nobody rushed to their aid, and they kept them waiting until they called for Iran's help, and General Qasem Soleimani, the IRGC Quds Force, rushed to his help and arrived in the city and helped them to rescue the city. And Iran was first to rush to their aid with weapons. That's what has been officially stated on various occasions by Mr. Barzani, who presides over the Iraqi Kurdistan region. The same happened with regard to Iraq and Syria. But who started actually this proxy force in this part of the world? In the words of General Martin Dempsey, who was the chairman under Obama of the Armed Forces of the United States, he said, and he told it during a Senate hearing where Mr. Lindsey Graham, the senator, was also present and presiding the session, that it was Saudi Arabia and the United States Arab allies in the region that started this war in Syria and Iraq. Joe Biden, when he was the vice president, told a Harvard address that Turkey, Qatar, and especially Saudi Arabia, they were in charge of this war. They started the militancy and proxy forces and the warfare in Syria and Iraq. Mr. National Advisor Jake Sullivan, who is now the National Security Advisor, also said in a cable that was released by WikiLeaks, he told State Secretary Clinton, Hillary Clinton, that Al-Qaeda in Syria was on the United States side. That's an official cable that was brought up during a Senate hearing by Ron Paul, where Mr. Mike Pompeo was also present, and he kept quiet and never defended and never denied the veracity and authenticity of this document. Also, General Michael Flynn, who headed the Pentagon Intelligence Department, and also it's very important, before he became the National Security Advisor, he appeared on Al Jazeera America, and he told Mr. Hassan, the host, that we knew that Daesh and Nusra and ISIS, Al-Qaeda were creating a caliphate in eastern Syria and western Iraq. We were completely informed of that, and we informed the Obama White House, but on two separate occasions in two reports. But the Obama White House never ever ordered us to do anything. Actually, they kept quiet, and this quiet response actually gave them a green light to go ahead. Gave the militants a go ahead to spread throughout the region and start this chaos. It was right at this time that they called, Syria and Iraq called for Iran's help. The United States meant to spread its hegemony in this region through two wars of Afghanistan and Iraq. They failed because Iran never allowed them to spread their forces and hegemony and impose their order in this region. Therefore, they went for a proxy warfare when the Arab Spring started, and they, through their allies.
Mustafa, is this the reason Iran was always desperate to secure nuclear technology? And this is what United States has been saying since day one, that Iran's nuclear program is primarily targeting this interest of United States in the region.
The largest number of man hours of inspections before and after the JCPOA. And they have never, ever found a shred of evidence that Iran has been moving towards military goals. If the United States really cared for Iran's nuclear ambitions, they would have stayed under the nuclear deal because it provides them with the harshest ever imposed regime of inspections on any nation. They have the access to all Iranian nuclear facilities with all the data, but they never cared and they dropped out of the nuclear deal. So what they matter is not just Iran's nuclear technology. It's bigger than that. Iran represents a role model in this region. There are many throughout the world who come to visit us, and when we ask them if you would like to your country to be Iran or one of these Arab rich or Arab allies of the United States, I was, somehow surprised when several of them have been repeatedly saying that they want to be Iran. When I asked them why, they said, because you've been under sanctions for 40 years, but you have been advancing in various areas of technology, in medicine, cancer treatment, cancer diagnosis, nuclear technology, missile technology, and you have spread your clout and influence throughout the region. And still, you are pioneering in nanotechnology, aerospace technology, satellite technology, and stem cell technology, and many other areas, despite the very harsh sanctions imposed on you, and you have never given it up, and you have defeated the United States. So this shows that you will be
Mustafa,
major.
we have heard from the international media that there are different point of views between the parliament of Iran and the government of Iran. Both see the United States engagement plan differently. How would you comment on that?
You know that all throughout the last 20 years, there have been agreements between Iran and the United States or the European countries, the United States allies in Europe. And in all these cases, based on what the US and European officials have been saying, Iran has been in compliance with all the terms of the agreements it has struck with the world powers. But they've never, ever responded, and they've never, ever held up their end of the bargain, because they are not looking for a conflict resolution approach. What they want is Iran's containment of Iran's power.
Thank you very much, Mustafa, for being with us. And now I am joined by two prestigious guests. I have the first Pakistani female ambassador to represent Pakistan in Iran with me in my studio. And also I am joined by Mr. Sultan Ali Haider, who is an expert of international economics. Ambassador Rafat, welcome to the program. And first of all, I would like to ask you, how do you think of this prevailing crisis between United States and Iran? Do you think things will get better from this point onward as they have been proceeded so far?
Well, thank you very much for having me on the program. Not in the immediate future. My answer would be no, I don't see things improving that rapidly. Because let's be fair, I mean, with the United States, the rivalry with Iran has been historical and long-standing. So just by one president going and another one coming, one administration being replaced by another, doesn't necessarily mean that the US will change its policy towards Iran. The US State Department, their own establishment, they have always been anti-Iran. And the sanctions, although President Obama had lifted them after the JCPOA, the anti-Iran sentiment is still very strong within the US establishment and vice versa. So this mistrust and this difficult period with the United States will continue, at least in the foreseeable future.
Ambassador, this threat perception is what United States is propagating every time. Would you agree that the threat towards Iran nuclear program is a bit overrated by the United States?
Well, you see, the thing is, we have to see that what is meant by being overrated. You see, for the United States per se, Iran may not be a threat directly. But they do see Iran as a threat to one of their strongest and most important allies in the region, and that is Israel. And Israel and Iran do have a hostility. They consider each other enemies. So any kind of threat to Israel is seen as a threat to the United States itself. And that's how they would rate it. So I wouldn't say they overrate it, because to them they may not be a threat, but they are a threat as far as the US is concerned to their most important ally. And even not only Israel, but also Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia and the United States are also very close allies.
Sultan, we have seen this economic problem, which is on a boiling point now. And Iran is under some sanctions that are increasing every time. We hear the word sanctions. We are hearing it since early 90s, and we are hearing it even today. Can you tell us about the journey of these sanctions and how does it affect Iran's economy?
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. First of all, thank you for inviting me, Shabahat. In terms of sanctions, essentially what they try to do is they force a country through non-military means to do things that the country may not be wanting to do, right? So in terms of sanctions, these are economic sanctions. They impact trade. So they impact trade through primarily banking sector and also payments in currency. Now the leverage that the United States has is that all of the trade or majority of the trade globally happens in US dollars. All of the US dollar trade and exchange of amount is routed through New York, right? So what they use that power to control any money exchanging hand between buyer and seller. That's how they block a country, and those are the kind of sanctions which have been imposed on Iran. And what they have been doing is they have been specifying increasing the number of trades which can happen in that country, and parts of the Iranian government and other entities which are under sanction. So that is the long and short of it. Now, in terms of the impact, it's important that we see what is the impact. So first of all, it's the impact on the GDP. If you can put up on screen the GDP impact. So we can see that Iranian GDP was suppressed due to the sanctions. Now, and there was also, we saw negative GDP. Then there was this era which gives us some empirical evidence into what happens when if the sanctions are lifted, right? So post the Iranian nuclear deal with the world, with the rest of the world, we certainly saw that their GDP is just like a spring, you know. So
does it only hurt Iran's economy, or does it hurt the economy of the countries that were trading with Iran?
You see, okay, it is hurting Iran, and it is hurting Iran badly. But to enforce a sanction, we can take example of two neighbors of Iran. So one is Pakistan, where we are sitting, and the other is United Arab Emirates. So interestingly, when the sanctions were harshly enforced around 2010, 2011, so in the UAE banking sector, what started happening was that Iranian-related accounts were started to get shut down. So a lot of trade to Iran was happening through Dubai. So now, when all those businesses started to get shut down, it was a large part of Dubai's economy was getting benefiting from that trade, because people couldn't trade with Iran directly. So anyone who was remotely related, they got impacted. So there was an impact on Dubai's GDP per se. Similarly, on the other side, it is Pakistan. So there's been a lot of news recently in terms of Pakistan's energy crisis. We're trying to import LNG, and it's expensive LNG or cheap LNG. The cheapest form is to get through a pipeline from Iran. Iran is desperate, so we can get a very good bargain, right? Impact could be in billions, and it's an ongoing thing, not just an annual impact, but we cannot do that, right?
So Ambassador, tell me about this development of declaring a part of Iran's military as a terrorist organization. Being an ambassador, tell me, do you see this happening very often in the diplomatic world?
No, but then Iran is very unique, because Iran's military is basically divided into two segments. You have the regular military, and then you have the Revolutionary Guards, and it is the Revolutionary Guards that have been declared sanctioned. And unfortunately, in the case of Iran, the Revolutionary Guards do wield more power than the regular military does, because they are in charge of manning the border posts. and they are larger in number, they are more influential, they come under the direct control of the supreme leader, and they are what the United States considers that they are responsible for all the activities or so-called terrorist activities along the borders, especially on the western borders and even on the eastern borders, and even in the neighboring countries like Syria and Iraq and so forth. So therefore, identifying a portion of the military is very unique, but then Iran's system is such that the Revolutionary Guards are separate from the regular military and they are more influential that way.
Ambassador, I have a tough question for you.
Go ahead.
How sweet or sour is the relationship between Pakistan and Iran at the moment?
I would say it's more sweet than sour. And I say that not because I only served there and interacted very closely with the Iranian people, but because we have so much in common. In fact, if you actually, with a level head and a cool mind, think about it, we have more in common with Iran than we have differences. Whether it's our faith, whether it is our culture, our language. People know more about Allama Iqbal in Iran than they probably know in Pakistan, because most of his poetry was in Farsi. So there's a lot of affinity, and in fact when I was there, I remember very distinctly that when they would know that there's a Pakistani, any Pakistani businessman or student or diplomat or anybody, the Iranians would actually reach out. So I think that our relations can be sweeter. We just have to play it very carefully in the current environment because of the sanctions and the difficulties. But sour, I wouldn't say. We do have problems on the borders, but those are, confined to just the border, and they are resolved. So I would say, yeah, sweeter than sour.
Okay, I'll come back to this later. Sultan, tell me about this hyperinflation. It's a new terminology, and we have just recently seen that Iranian currency has become the most devalued currency in the world. Tell me more about it.
So essentially, due to these sanctions, Iran is not getting US dollars, it cannot buy stuff, so it's sort of resorting to barter. So because of that, the Iranian currency just plummeted, right? And while it has plummeted, similarly, buying stuff from outside becomes more difficult. So that puts it into a hyperinflation spiral. If you have inflation more than 40%, 45%, then you get into the territory of hyperinflation. And that's the territory they are in, which creates a lot of difficulty for the common people. And very interesting thing which I would share is how it gets accelerated is people are selling that their currency and buying assets. So their stock market is going up. So people are buying stuff, they're buying durable goods, they're buying cars, furniture, property, whatever, again to preserve whatever wealth they have. So that's a very interesting dynamic what is going on. And in case the Biden administration gives some relaxation, they move forward. That's a very interesting thing, how that will play, because if again more dollars come in, suddenly in terms of GDP growth, Iranian government is planning to invest and spend a lot more in the economy. Now that will really push up the money supply, which again will contribute to the inflation.
Ambassador, my last question. The diplomatic gulf between the Arab world and Iran hasn't narrowed down in the last so many years. How would you comment on that? Is it more a foreign policy failure, or is it the history of the region that, or the religious differences that have not allowed the two sides to come closer?
I think it's perhaps a bit of all of those. The rivalry, the animosity between basically Saudi Arabia and Iran is pre-Islamic. I mean, it goes back, way, way back. It has increased over a period of time because of religious differences and practices, but mostly it's strategic and foreign policy related. Both are vying to be regional powers in the area. Both are wanting their hegemony in the region. So they are rivals politically that way. I wouldn't say that it's exaggerated, it's there, but for us in Pakistan, We, of course, as we have been doing, we should continue to play a balancing act because both countries are important for us. Saudi Arabia is a very important country for us. Similarly, Iran, being a neighbor, is an important country. And we have to play a very careful game, as it were, in this whole regional rivalry. We used to face this a lot. I mean, I know Iran and both the countries blame us at many fora and privately and publicly also, and try that we should take sides. That is something that we have never done and we should never do, because this rivalry will remain. As I said, because it's a very historic rivalry, but we just have to make sure that it doesn't grow into something which will envelop the entire region into some kind of turmoil. Already we are in a region which is full of turmoil.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for being in my program. Thank you very much, Mr. Sultan. Ladies and gentlemen, the problem of Iran is now on the boil. The problems between the United States and Iran are not going to be sorted out in a short run, but humanity has to remember that coercion, hunger, and use of violence are perhaps not the right toolkits to sort out the differences between states. We'll join you next week with another program. Until then, Allah Hafiz.